some space in the conversation. So with that, I will introduce Fawn Kennedy and Gina Valeria, who are both from Sonoma State University. Fawn is a literacy expert at the College of Education, and Gina is a journalist and professor at the Department of Communication and Media Studies. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you guys. You're both co-hosts, so do with us what you will.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We wanted to start by acknowledging the state of the protests over the death of George Floyd and many others. And just to say that the idea of consequences, which is in the title of the podcast today, takes on a whole new meaning when we consider this past week in the news and in our communities. And surely this context, which is really important in any discussion of memes, will shape the way that we read this story today. So we just wanted to start by doing that.
Yes, thank you so much, Ron. I hope everyone is safe and that your communities are doing all right. So first, we wanted to give an overview of the podcast, which I'm sure you've all listened to, but Hidden Brain with host Shankar Vedantam uses science and storytelling to reveal the unconscious patterns that drive human behavior, shape our choices, and direct our relationships. So the episode we're looking at is Online Behavior, Real-Life Consequences, the unfolding of a social media scandal. And Vedantam tells the story of a high school senior who was admitted to Harvard, but then it got rescinded because he participated in a Facebook group with other incoming freshmen, and they were sharing extremely offensive memes. So the story outlines the fallout for, quote, William, pseudonym, and how it affected not just his admission to Harvard, but other aspects of his life.
And it's really important too the way that the podcast was opened. It's a really small story, but I think it also kind of sets up and frames the whole episode. And that is about a Hungarian man named Peter who photoshopped a picture of himself that he had taken years before 9/11 on the observation deck of the World Trade Center. You know, and he's standing there, you know, kind of emotionless, looking at the camera, and in the background you see a plane kind of arcing in right before, you know, what we know it would be impact. And he shared it as a joke with a few of his friends via email, and they shared it with a few friends, and before he knew it, it went viral. And his image not only spawned an urban legend about an unwitting tourist and victim of 9/11, but whose camera would reveal that final shot, and it was found in the rubble if you listen to the podcast. But the image, his image, began popping up as a meme in other historic events, like the JFK assassination. He was in the motorcade, those kinds of things. And Vedantam says that he lost control of his image and he became, quote, a meme star. And Peter said that he never thought it would go outside of his circle of friends. And so that's how the podcast opens, with this really small story, and then it leads into the larger story that Gina just shared.
And so our first discussion question, and we have all kinds of things we want to talk about, but that idea of losing control of the image or the message, and also how powerful messages are. I mean, I think we've seen that in the unrest and the protests of the past week. And but what Fawn and I talked a lot about, or what really resonated with me first when I heard this was, there's a lot out in the media of young white guys committing heinous acts, and they're made likable or sympathetic. And I felt that was the kind of the first thing that hit me when I listened to this podcast, because Vedantam says, I like him. And so I was like, here's another. And so what really stood out to me, I don't know if anybody's watched the Netflix series You, but my husband and I have had some really, really deep conversations about that. It's about a young man who's sort of obsessive, stalkerish, but he's so sweet, and he ends up killing people, and people identify him. So we included some links about that phenomenon. And then Fawn and I were contrasting it with Black victims who are then vilified, such as children, Trayvon Martin and others across the country, we're coming up on the birthday of Andy Lopez, who was killed in Sonoma County. He would be 20 this year, and a child, you know, he was, I think, 12. And so contrasting, like making white characters or even white actual people who commit crimes likable or sympathetic versus Black victims. And so I guess we wanted to open there and talk a little bit about that phenomenon and see what you might
Or
say.
if you wanted to start with your general overall impressions.
Oh, sure. Yeah, there's that too.
Either one.
So can I go first quickly? Because I'm also live tweeting, so I'd like to stay live tweeting while others talk about their first impressions. So I love the fact that he opened with that fantastic photo story, which sort of tumbled into a fake news scenario, the tourist to death guy meme. And when he started talking about William, I just thought that, I mean, aren't memes often dank and offensive, especially on subreddits or groups? I mean, that's the entire point of it. And I mean, later on, you know, as you hear the podcast, you also see, I wrote down a few things which he also mentioned when he was being interviewed. Like, for instance, I mentioned about peer pressure. They might not actually agree with everyone or everything, and they might just go along with it. Also the point about people who are being oppressed, joking about it, because there was this memes conference by King's College London that I recently attended, and Anna Denisova mentioned her work. It's a book on internet memes in society, published in 2019 by Routledge. And one of the things that she found in her work was that memes are used as a coping mechanism. And there's this sense of control that people want to take back via humor in memes, especially when William mentions those instances where the Black guy shares the Emmett Till meme and the Mexican guy or the Hispanic guy shares the Piñata meme, and so on and so forth. And I mean, who polices what is right and what is wrong? And what about the crazy frat parties and the initiation tasks that these people have to do once they are on campus? And doesn't USA protect free speech? That's what's causing difficulties in getting stronger laws like GDPR or versions of GDPR to USA, right? So that's me.
Hey everybody, this is Wes in Oklahoma City. I'm super interested as a teacher of 5th and 6th grade students to have a conversation about memes, but also to figure out how to not go too dark with you know, in terms of all of this. And that's really challenging. But like my kids that are on TikTok or some forms of social media, which is not a universal, are absolutely in the middle of all this. And one of the things that I want to help them talk about and think about, you know, is what's just not funny, because there are things here that are just not things that we should be joking about at all. And it just is, it's so striking how different the world and the landscape of information is for kids connected to social media and then adults and teachers. And I really want to bridge that. And I even want to do a lesson next year, probably for my 6th graders, that touches on this. And so I'm excited to hear these resources and to dive into this. And has anybody done that with middle schoolers, or does anybody have thoughts about how do we get into this, but not, you know, completely go into the rabbit hole? Because I feel like if I was teaching high school or college, I would not have that hesitation. But with middle schoolers, you know, I know that we're talking about advertising and hacking brains. I know I'm safe with that, but I'm a little hesitant as we jump into memes because it's so dark. But I have kids that are sharing these and that are immersed in this, and so that's something I'm struggling with.
So Wes, we have this topic of the pleasure of transgression, right? So we're talking about memes, transgressive memes from the point of view of those who create them, right? And it turns out that high school media teachers often encounter kids who play with transgression as a form of social power. Because after all, that's what adolescence is about. You're learning how to be, how to have power, how to wield power, and then also hopefully you're learning about how to be responsible in your use of that social power. And so we did a small study. I'm going to put it in the chat room. This was published last year in a journal called the International Electronic Journal of Elementary Education. What we did was we interviewed high school teachers and we asked them what kinds of transgression did they encounter when their students made media in the classroom? What kinds of transgression were part of when you give kids the power to make media? They will often say things that make everybody uncomfortable. And how do you handle that as an educator? What's the way in which it can become a teachable moment to talk about those boundary conditions that you just described? So I do think there's a lot of pedagogical value, but there's also risk as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
And I wonder also if, I don't know if the slippery slope argument, but how their transgressions can lead down a path to, and I'm sure you're already covering that, but I feel like that's something I talk about. I teach college, but I have 7 nieces and nephews, and we talk about that a lot.
The radicalization potential, you know, that Rabbit Hole podcast from the New York Times is fantastic about that. And I've wanted to do, we have parent university sessions. We were doing them before COVID. We need to restart those this year. But like, I've wanted to do one on that, not because, you know, I think our students are necessarily going to be radicalized and move, you know, try to, you know, go join a foreign army somewhere, but just the white supremacy radicalization, the sexism, the racism, it's such a huge thing. And again, I think there's a big distance between adult perceptions and student perceptions and just even life and where they live. And I see that gap, and I want to, you know, hopefully be a constructive agent and bridge in between them to have conversations and raise awareness and dialogue about it.
If I could add on to that, Wes, something that really struck me about perceptions is a recurring theme that we've seen in several titles that we've explored as part of this club, is that youth are not really connecting the two worlds of online life and real life. And he says that William says that very explicitly as part of his interview, that he wasn't really connecting those two worlds. And he was saying things in there and putting things in there that he would never even think in real life, which I thought was quite striking and worth exploring as well.
I wonder, thinking about how to do this with middle school or just anyone really, what the benefit would be of just starting with studying comedy, like not memes, but comedy. And I'm thinking about in the podcast when William's talking about the meme that he put up with the man is the slug, and I went from friend zone to rape zone, and the man's the butt of the joke. And I was like, I don't know if, like, okay, I see that William understands that in comedy, like who are you poking at is really important, but like, does that joke get at that? Like, does that achieve that goal? And I just think, you know, if he had some practice maybe in identifying how the construction of jokes or like how comedy works, like if that would help kids or anyone really to be able to identify when a meme does what you think it's going to do and when it doesn't.
I just wanted, Gina and I talked about that a little bit as well, and also this idea of kind of deconstructing what a meme is. And a lot of the images that they talked about in the podcast have so much meaning and history attached to them, right? And so when we use images, when we make jokes, and I really love that you brought that up, all of these things have these additional layers of meaning, and a lot of times we don't think about all of that history that's attached, that kind of attaches to images.
I was going to add, I like that idea of thinking about the history of it, I keep on trying. I've never tried to do this. I think I may try to do this at some point in a class in the future, is to try to talk about the history of things like stand-up comedy, going through periods of extremely important transgression that were part of, like, I'm always trying to figure Lenny Bruce out, because Lenny Bruce did things that ever since that moment would be incredibly problematic, and were problematic in the moment, but for different reasons. It was mostly obscenity rather than discussions of race and gender that he was involved in. And some of it was, it's very, very difficult, but I think it's interesting to think of it in the history leading up to, what does a culture find funny and why? We have a very deep history of ethnic humor. That was kind of what vaudeville was all about. So, where is it that is, because we also then see all of these attempts, and I think what William was talking about is trying to be funny to increase social capital in an incredibly inappropriate way. But what makes it, how do you cut the cord so that what you're doing is acceptable and advancing a critical issue versus stepping over the line and doing something that's considered in really poor taste, which I get accused of a lot at dinner. So, just saying that wrong thing, taking it a little too far.
Lauren in the chat is asking, how do we define transgression? That's a great question. Anybody want to take a stab at that? Because I think Ralph is suggesting some forms of transgression can be, well, possibly good, actually.
So to link that with what the current protests that are going on in USA, one would say that those protests are transgression, and whatever change has come, like voting rights or gay marriage or etc., have come through those transgressions. So are all transgressions wrong?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I obviously don't have the answer, but I think we're exploring that now. I don't know if any of you have watched Trevor Noah's discussion of what's going on. And he talks a little bit about that, like the contract we make, and people who are, if mainstream society is not abiding the contract, and people who are affected by that decision or that are committing, I guess, transgressions, right? But they're doing it to sort of call attention to the fact that, hey, we don't feel like we're being protected. And so you're right. Yeah, I think in some senses transgressions can be helpful, and also they can be fence testing or border testing. How far can we go? What's appropriate? What's not appropriate? And how do we figure this out? And then obviously we've seen that they can be harmful as well, as the case with this podcast, where these memes got really dark and yeah.
I just think, this is Patty, I just think that it's really interesting to go back and reference the phrase, the meme that well-behaved women rarely make history. And
have that t-shirt.
Yeah. And, and talk about what does that mean? Because it is true, to affect real social change, we've often got to go beyond or outside of the boundaries. The status quo wants to keep the status quo. So a lot of the time, I think it goes back to the simple message, not just of who is creating the message, but what is the purpose? And if the purpose is to, afford a group of people more rights, or if it is to make sure voices are heard because they obviously haven't been enough about what's going on with our police forces, or what's going on with guns in schools, any of that stuff. How do transgressions affect that? And do they work?
Yeah, there's like, I'll just say, embedded in that is intent versus impact too. Like it's not, it's, you consider the intent of the transgression and also the impact of the transgression. You can't really not consider one or the other. Sorry, Ralph.
Oh, that's okay. I had an interesting discussion. My daughter was at one of the protests yesterday, and she was asking this morning because apparently she had read somewhere that somebody was saying that nonviolence is racist, which is really complicated, and we talked about it for quite a while and didn't make it any less complicated. But terms like, how do we think about nonviolence? How do we think about civility, which is a loaded term that's gotten really problematic, which I think all function in the same universe as transgression. Like at what point does transgression, as we're watching these things unfold, does a certain kind of transgression help, and other kinds of transgressions that seem to be actually causing more of a problem? And when we get into discussions of like property crimes and people who are maybe self-identified anarchists, there's as Wes would probably testify, some reporting that's going on in Oklahoma City that's appalling in the way that they're talking about the groups of protesters, and this really kind of disturbing analysis that's going on. So I just think it's interesting to think about how these terms, because it's so hard to have a good conversation about them in any depth, unfortunately.
I think that kind of goes to the question of consequences then. And so, when we're thinking about, we've just heard that, a lot of times these have consequences that are reflected, in systems that have real impact on people's lives. And, and then thinking about things like, small transgressions at the dinner table, or like I've seen that in work I've done with young people and digital media in schools, where they'll try to push the boundaries just a little bit. So it kind of goes back to, that idea that Vedantam was saying, I kind of like this kid, and, how do we feel about, that was something that he said in the middle, how do we feel about the consequences that William faced in this context?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, Fawn. I found myself drawn to one line in the podcast that just stopped me in my tracks, and I ruminated on it a lot. And it's been mentioned before briefly, the line where he says something like, the awareness that he was using pain as a currency to win new friends, right? And I think as that rung true to me I was a terrible teenager. I mean, truly, I was a terrible I was a mean girl, right? And I understand that, as a fat kid, I was so marginal. I was beyond marginal. I was so marginal. So for me to exercise social power and to play with social power involved transgression, because I was exploiting my pain, right, in order to get recognition. And I feel like that was the moment at which I appreciated the podcaster's effort to humanize this kid. And that's why it made me sad that Harvard did not have the courage to treat this person as a human being, but had to stay in the politically correct zone. And that's the tension I felt, because I could understand wanting to be in that zone, but I also had so much empathy for the kid who seemed a lot like I was when I was young and dumb.
Exactly, young and dumb, right? I mean, look at those people and sitting on their high and mighty pedestal, making all these judgments about a 17-year-old. And it's not like he's done something, he's actually done something, right?
But I think he sounds like he's better for it. Like he sounds like he really learned something, and he is really articulate about like what happened. And I think it's like a best case scenario. Maybe he's going to have a better mark on the world because of going through this. I think for him at least, the consequences worked, I think.
Well, I agree that I saw that as well, and I thought I like this kid too. He's intelligent, he's articulate. I mean, in terms of how he's analyzing what happened, it was really quite impressive. But I think what stuck out to me the most, and goes along with what Renee was saying, was at the end when he's talking about the other kids in that group who were, Jew and Black, and they're putting memes out as this coping mechanism that I think Davina mentioned earlier. To me, that when I heard that, I thought, wow, Harvard missed a teaching moment. Like, because clearly, if we had brought all of those kids together and really had a conversation about what was happening and why, it might have, I don't know, broadened our perspective at Harvard in particular's perspective on this whole situation, and maybe have created young people who could have then had a voice in a much bigger way about what's happening online and how it impacts people.
Yeah, and I wonder if that, yeah, I appreciate what you said, Andrea and Renee and everybody. And I'm wondering, I think about how we in the US deal with transgression. We're a very punitive country, I think, and I think about other places where approaches are more rehabilitative. And I'm not sure how I feel about Harvard's decision, because I do agree sometimes we need a little smack back to learn a lesson, but also the consequences were severe when, Andrea, you're absolutely right. I think there was a real teachable moment there for the kids. So I don't know what to think, but I wonder, like, that is kind of where we tend to go in our culture. And I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I have a thought about this because I was very surprised actually about that reaction by Harvard. I never thought that, I'm right here in Paris, I would never see the same reactions, or that the administration of Sorbonne would take a look at the social media of the students, what they're doing there. They would not care about that. So once the students accept it, it's accepted. So I was very surprised actually, and I asked some friends around me what they were saying. They were all like looking at me and saying, that's kind of strange. So, and then I read also in the article that apparently there's this common practice to verify the social media of the students. And that's, again, I was a bit surprised about that. So that's like from another culture, to just give some input.
Is that just because the Sorbonne is oblivious, Michael? Like,
I don't know, but also like Sciences Po, I believe, or like all these institutions in France, or even like in Germany, there's huge public institutions. They don't have time. Probably they don't have time, and maybe there's less of this kind of morally thing saying, "Hey, you did something." I don't know. It's I don't know. There's not that moral level.
Less moralistic. That's a great point.
So
I wonder if it's also. Go ahead. I've been talking a lot.
Well, I just have a question that related to France, I guess, and French students. Is there this kind of, mean is a nice way of putting it, racist, misogynistic, violent stuff shared by people that age, amongst French young adults and youth? Or, I mean, maybe just anecdotally.
Not that I know.
Yeah.
I'm not too much aware, so maybe that's really like something specific here. And maybe if there would be, maybe the reaction would be different than, of course, also in France. So there's like these kind of bullying things going on, like on WhatsApp. So I'm not sure if that's kind of, if you can compare that, you see. But not about memes. I have not heard too much about that.
One more reason that we all need to get media literacy into our schools. University is too late. It's got to be middle school and high school. I mean, obviously starting as young as possible, but there have to be serious conversations and serious project-based learning that happens in middle school and high school, because I think that kids get an idea that, they just slide into this slippery slope wise for whatever the reasons, the way Renee mentioned her reasons for being a mean girl or whatever. Now there are so many more pernicious and harmful ways to be a mean girl. It's not just, I was a victim of mean girls at that age,
but it was just in person in those days, and you could go home and cry and then be at home and be safe. But now it's 24/7, and yeah, we've got our work, among other works, cut out for us in this country, as we see these days. This is one of the many things that we've got to keep pushing on, tackling.
So I teach high school, and one of the things that really sort of stuck with me about this is something I've thought a lot about, but because I also have kids, but you know, this was a student who was, you know, exercising some agency, and yes, it was transgressive. But, you know, like whenever you put yourself out in the public sphere like this, whether it's humor or whether you're just making a statement, that there's like inherent risk in that, because we are now in a place where your mistakes have a global audience, and they can take on a life of their own that have nothing to do with you, or whether you're a decent person or what your intent was. Like all of those things become subservient to sort of like the beast that kind of just is generated by this thing. And so even when, you know, we were talking about humor, I mean, it was funny because I had this initial response like, well, the minute you start talking about a joke, like it's not funny anymore, you know, but by the same token, part of what makes lots of humor funny, not all, is like the willingness to risk, right? I mean, I'm reminded of like Nureyev, you know, I think it was, who said, you know, people don't come to see me do great dancing. They come to see if I'm going to break my leg. And that there is, you know, there's always this sort of risk involved, and the rewards can seem great because, and in this case, you know, a 17-year-old, the reward was he's got new friends and his popularity and stuff. And I mean, I certainly felt really terribly for the kid, but at the same time, I'm also kind of taken with this idea that, you know, I mean, how bad were the consequences? Like, he didn't get into Harvard. You know, that I'm okay. Like, I don't want to dismiss the seriousness of that, but there's a lot worse things in the world to not getting into Harvard, and Harvard isn't necessarily a golden ticket. And even the way that this was, like, this piece was centered, as great I think as it was on storytelling, it was still kind of promoting this sort of very narrow view of what works and what should be aspired to. And I mean, you know, life will go on for this kid, and probably in a really positive way, like somebody said. I mean, it's a shame, and it's a drag, and I actually feel more empathy and sympathy for him from the standpoint that, you know, here he made a mistake that I think a lot of 17-year-olds could make really, really easily, just from ignorance and lack of development, and he got sort of stuck in a spiral that he really had no ability to get out of. I guess I can stop there. That's plenty.
I'm just actually, can I ask a question? Or to anyone actually, do you think that Vatan, I'm sorry, I always mispronounce his name, that the host's framing of the issue defined how we perceived William, and that actually with a fairly minor amount of editing and replacement, you could actually frame it completely differently? And so,
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think
so.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I definitely think so, and because I was also reminded. I think I have the link somewhere, but it's a few years old. But there's a great article about, which was basically like, shut up about Harvard already, and it was basically about how media sort of celebrates the Ivy League, and we get this very, very warped picture of what it's like to even go to university. You know, because like everybody thinks that when you go off to, I mean, at least in America, it does seem, and again, it's, when I say everybody, I should watch myself because it's obviously not everybody, but there's a lot of people in America that think going off to college is like going off to Animal House. And that's not right either, you know, but I definitely think the framing is a thing. And I think part of it in this particular piece was it makes the kid that much more sympathetic to a certain kind of person, because it seems like this kid was Charlie in the chocolate factory. And in reality, I'm not sure that he was. You know, I mean, I think he was just a kid, and he was really talented, and he like was obviously a really bright kid, and he made a mistake that he couldn't get himself out of. And that part's awful, because I feel like kids can't make mistakes. I mean, you know, like, computers were around when I was a kid, but like generally speaking, you'd screw up, and you know, your friends and your family would know about it, and maybe a couple of other families, but it wasn't like zipping around the world.
I wanted to say, I was thinking, what kind of education did William have? And it brings us to like Wes's first thing, like what kind of digital citizenship or whatever you want to call it did he have in 4th and 5th and 6th grade? I don't think he was ignorant. I think he knew. He even said there was that pit in my stomach before I hit send or right after, where I knew this was over a line. So I think of it as, well, one, I'm sort of glad this happened to somebody so that we can use it as a teachable moment when we do talk about it with kids, because it's a good conversation. But I also think it speaks more to just like teen developmental stages and processes with risk taking and wanting to be liked and be included and all that. And maybe there's the social emotional learning part that we could do better at too, with empathy and building confidence in our kids so they don't have to do this kind of stuff. So I think it's beyond, it's bigger than just, you know, media literacy education or digital citizenship. It's the development of our kids as responsible humans in our digital world. And because we still want them to enjoy being on social media and doing all those things. So I don't know.
Yeah, I want to ask a question. There are a couple good questions in the chat, but I wanted to first address the idea of Harvard as this sort of held up as this elite university. Fawn and I had a brief chat about one thing I think that college admissions scandal taught us was that a lot of people who were not going to get into the elite colleges did just fine, right? Because so they graduated, they got their degrees, and then we learned, oh, you shouldn't have gotten in. So I think that was, you know, I wish that mirror or that piece of the story was explored a little more, but I thought that was an interesting angle, and I think that applies here as well. Again, he got into a bunch of other great schools, or a couple other great schools. But I wanted to ask, based on the conversation we're having now, the idea of consequences and the idea of, so Ralph asked about Amy Cooper, and how would you talk about this in a classroom in relation to William's experiences and choices? Because Amy Cooper, the action she took in Central Park could have led to harm of someone else, and though it felt really easy and innocuous for her to do it, and that kind of brings me back to the idea of sharing these memes. Of course, 17-year-olds can make dumb decisions, but how do we teach them, you know, to make better choices? And it seems like just a meme, but where does it go, and how do you follow the potential consequences of that?
One thing that makes me think about we mentioned earlier the pain that was being expressed or worked through in the group, and that the Jewish kid was posting anti-Semitic meme or whatnot. And I think that what's really would be like a really important media literacy / digital citizenship lesson or understanding for those students is audience and context collapse. And though you put that out with a certain intent, what's the impact when someone who is just looking for an excuse to say something anti-Semitic and then sees that, they don't know who put that out there or why or what the intent of the author was. And people are saying that was a missed opportunity by Harvard. Maybe that was Harvard's responsibility to teach, but yeah, going back to like 5th, 6th grade, like that's a great topic to unpack, and it's so complicated with so many ethical layers. And yeah.
Has anyone seen, I put it in the chat a little bit earlier, there was a really short video piece on The Atlantic called Digilante, the ethical folly of modern witch burning. And so when we're talking about, you know, audience and losing control of certain things, it's just a really short story about somebody. And actually the person who shared a video that he took on a bus of some racist, misogynist interaction between some people. I think it might have been in Australia on the bus. He posted it to Facebook, and then he says in his words, he became the hero of the story for sharing it and, you know, shining a light on racism and misogyny. And then he said that it spiraled so out of control, and he learned more about the people who had said the things and the consequences that they were facing. And he said that he quickly, you know, felt really horrible about it. So he went from feeling like a hero to feeling like he had no control over it. So I'm just curious about all those. So we're, you know, looking at Harvard, we're looking at consequences for the kids that didn't get in. And like Andrea noted, there were other kids who, out of the 45,000 that they say apply, and only like 5,000 or something got in, but also in real life, what those kinds of consequences happen when it goes viral.
I was just I think that it's interesting how the sequence of events, you know, because so part of the problem is that, right, time only moves forward. So how, one of the things I've been struck by over the last 4 or 5 days was how I've been learning about what's going on with all of the protests, and how when you become aware, like there was an incident of a truck that ran a bridge in Minneapolis. I hadn't seen it until this morning. I don't know if the video was circulating, but there's such a kind of like awkward stumble, you know, as I've been looking. So, you know, having posted a meme and then what happens afterwards becomes its own story. It has like kind of a sequence of events, and there's control seems kind of like an illusion, right? It goes out, and then the reactions to it are, you know, complicated, sometimes very heavily bot influenced, sometimes very heavily influenced by machines and algorithms that seem to want to like enhance the polarizing possibilities of them.
Yeah, I think that for me, the bot question is an important one. In watching a lot of the live feeds of the unrest over the past week, I accidentally opened the chat on YouTube, which is on the side now, and it was just going a mile a minute. You know, it was you couldn't even read anything before things came up. And I looked at how many viewers there were, and I'm like, it is impossible for the chat to be that active with that amount of viewers unless there was something automated going on. And I think, and then there was a recent article or study that at least half of the chatter about COVID-19 on social media has been bots. So I think that's an important question, because bots are inciting, right? And so they can incite this space where we go into dark places or go too far or take the conversation to a place that goes down a dark path.
One of the best resources I found about just opening our eyes to bots and the ways in which they weaponize social media and try to cross these issues from social media to mainstream media is a series, and I'll put it into the chat, by Destin, who has the YouTube channel Smarter Every Day, and he did a 3-part series on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. It freaking blows your mind. And I did a workshop for the Atlas conference in April last year, and I called it Filtering the Exoflood, and talking about media literacy, filtering strategies. But anyway, that video series is one I would just love to share with every teacher, and probably kid too, because we don't realize how this landscape is so driven by algorithms and people who are very good coders and know social media and are using it for malicious intents.
I was going to say another vote for more media literacy, which, you know, writ large, in other words, to understand the political economy behind it, and the technology behind it. Because I look at Twitter all the time because I'm obviously following news of breaking news events, but I'm also trying to figure out what's happening in Haiti and I'm actually trying to work on an article right now because there's about to be thousands of bodies starting to pile up, and the mainstream media in the US doesn't write about it. So I go on Twitter, and if I go to latest, it's totally different than if I go to top. And I actually have no idea, but I would guess that at least 30% are fake. Fake, either they're humans in another country or they're bots, and they're just generated at like they're just after clicks. And so I have to spend all this time scrolling until I see something that I think is from a credible source. And then I take a guess, and then I go, here, there, and there. And that's after years of living and working in Haiti and years of living and working on media literacy. So imagine someone who's just a regular grown-up person or a younger person. It's, I think understanding the technological and the profit-oriented
made a Twitter
things
thread
that are
about some weird
behind
activity
this
I
crap
saw online.
is
And after
key.
I posted,
Wait, what? Sorry.
Jane, could you repeat the last sentence, please? The last part of what you said?
I think I said, because sometimes I'm just stream of consciousness, but I think I said, I think understanding and having anyone, adult or young person, understand the technological, but also the profit-oriented goals that are behind the stuff that they're seeing, whether it is a Netflix show or it's a tweet or it's a YouTube thing, that it's about money and it's about getting the eyeballs. And what sells or what grabs are the more audacious things. People have written about that in a much more eloquent way than I am explaining it here. But that is really important. And yeah, that's really important. So, media literacy has to include that kind of a political economy, I would say a radical political economy approach.
So that last bit I think actually is really resonant, because one of the things that I've always sort of considered, and what I try to explain to students is, all media is a construction, and I sort of begin with that notion. But what you have is you have this sort of media, like mass media, right? And on some level, and not all of it, but there's like a considerable amount of mass media that's built on a kind of exploitive model in one way or another. But the thing about a lot of sort of manufactured media, right, is it goes through there's a whole sort of team of people that are considering the ramifications and the marketing and like it's a really collaborative effort. Yet, like a mobile phone in the hands of one person, whether it's an adult or a teenager, it's like there's no team, and there's no one necessarily to check you to tell you whether this is a good idea, and it's your tantamount. It's like you might think it's a great idea, but it's like you practically are handing a loaded gun to somebody, and so that's like a really important thing, I think, is to sort of discuss the exploitive nature of commercial media, because it's trying to create some kind of profit, however it might be. And social media has kind of amplified that, because it's taken down all the sort of editorial barriers and stops that sometimes are like good stops. It's not that you're trying to like censor people, but like it's good that it's a collaborative effort.
Just keep coming back to that idea of consequences in light of what Fred just said and Jane was saying. So complicated, and even when we use media literacy and teach our students, there's so much to navigate, and and being impulsive and young. And I was reading a story about the neuroscience behind the arguments about adolescent development, the conversations that we have about risky behavior, and they were saying, oh, if we don't have fully developed frontal cortexes, and it impacts our ability to make decisions. And then there are other neuroscience coming out saying, well, actually, it's a design, by design, to have that kind of curiosity and risky behavior, because that's how we learn. We, you know, transgress a little bit and have consequences and modify our behavior. And so I think it comes back to like the consequences of our actions, even if, you know, they're in this place where it's small and, you know, only with my friends or, you know, whatever that is. And then these big consequences, what do we do with that? Even if we know better, like that kid said he had a knot in his stomach, even if we know better, sometimes those things happen.
And Christine made a great point earlier to add to that, that some kids don't have the luxury of making dumb decisions because it can be, the consequences can be so steep. And so they're getting an education, right? They're getting an education at home from their parents, from their families. And so even with this, you know, not fully formed prefrontal cortex and there are still ways to educate and provide structure and framing so that when you get into that moment and you have the pit in your stomach, you can remember the well-ingrained lessons of don't do it, you know, and that's why I think media literacy education, as we keep saying, is becoming more and more critical and, you know, more and more necessary every day, to try to provide the structure and framing as kids are kids and navigate their lives.
So someone once said that, maybe someone said it or maybe I read it somewhere, do not post anything online you wouldn't find yourself saying or writing in public, in person. And I mean, it does seem like good advice, but I also wonder if nobody's ever made a bad joke, if nobody's ever said something that they've regretted. I mean, I know I've had word vomits in government, non-government offices, which have been, I've regretted saying those things for weeks on end, right? So circling back to this guy being super young, not exactly why he didn't accept that he had that knot in his stomach and he thought that he was doing something wrong. Are you seriously telling me that we don't have offensive jokes and memes have suddenly become the portal for offensive jokes? I mean, I've interacted with some people, some young people here, part of my research work, who've told me that dank memes have been educational for them. So they didn't know, for instance, about Marx. And then they found a dank meme about Marx and they were like, I don't get the joke. So they sort of went into the Googling spree of finding out who that image is of. And then they went into looking at Marxism and what it means and why it's funny. So it's sort of a rabbit hole of a different kind, but a good one, right?
I want to call, yes, thank you so much. And I want to call out a question that Samantha asked in the chat. What about the targets of these jokes and what's the impact on them? So is there any thoughts that they want to share about that?
So far as I can see, in terms of the conversation that Shankar Vedagan had with William, I don't think there were really any targets per se of the memes that were shared, right? And dank memes are usually like that. So another interview that I was reading for an essay that I wrote a couple of weeks ago was that there is a line that you cross even in dank memes, beyond which those subreddit administrators sort of give you a warning. And then after repeated warnings, you're thrown out of that subreddit. So, for instance, rape memes are cool as long as you don't mention the victim or the victim's name or identity in some or the other way. Right. So I know there'll be a lot of people here who are slightly older would be like, no, you don't joke about rape no matter what. But I mean, I don't know.
No, I appreciate that. And it looks like we have to start wrapping up the conversation, but you make a great point. And earlier in the chat, someone asked, what if the memes were targeted at specific people rather than just this general concept of this nefarious idea? So I think you make an excellent point that we should grapple with as we move forward. So thank you so much. So I just want to say thank you. It's my first time jumping into your chat room, and I appreciate being able to co-host and moderate the discussion with Fawn. It's been so exciting, and I joined your group, and hopefully I'll be back in the room to converse with you because I had a great time.
Yeah. So many thanks to Fawn and to Gina. You guys did an excellent job leading us through this really, really interesting and complicated discussion. So just a couple of reminders. So Michael, are we doing a shelter in place edition this month?
Yes, I would love to. I'm planning to do one on the 22nd of June. It's going to be hosted by, I hope, Jason and myself. We want to talk about conspiracy theories and the psychology, sociology, politics maybe behind it. We have not decided on the podcast so far. But I believe like with the COVID, but also like I want to learn more about that, you see, so that's also my motivation and have that discussion with all of you. But also there was that one video that went viral, the pandemic, I believe. I haven't found it anymore. It was taken away or taken off the YouTube and the Facebook pages. But I wanted to talk about that with, I'll bring it to the MediaClub, and I hope to see you all there on the 22nd of June.
Yeah. And so in the meantime, we have our title, our July regular title, so you can find information about that on the website via the link that I put in the chat. And we're at 11 o'clock now, and if you normally participate in virtually viral hangouts, I recommend you shoot over there immediately because today is the very last one. So hopefully I'll see you there. Otherwise, you'll hear from me later, and I'll send out all these amazing links that you guys have put into the chat. So thank you all for being here.
And thank you, Gina. Thank you, Fawn. Fantastic.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice one.
Please check the live tweet and see how it goes. Let me know what we can change.